John, one of the more extended stories, probably the longest continuous story or episode in the book of Numbers, comes in chapters 20 through 24. And it's the story of a non-Israelite, this prophetic figure named Balaam. Who is this guy, and how come he takes up part of my Bible?
You know, until quite recently, we didn't know anything at all about Balaam except what you get here. Mm-hmm. And then he showed up on an inscription from a place called Deir Allah, and seems to be a prophet who predicts disasters of various sorts.
So this is, it's a non-Israelite prophet. We found in a non-Israelite text, right? Deir Allah isn't in Israel.
So he was presumably prophesying on behalf of some other god. Now, actually, here in Numbers, it's the Lord who's telling him what to say, which seems, quite inappropriate. In a way, he should be getting this from Kamosh or somebody.
Right.
But they're adopting him. They're bringing him into the fold. The analogy that comes to my mind on this is much later. It's the Sibyl. In the Hellenistic world. And in the case of the Sibyl, it's clear enough, it has some propaganda value, which I think it surely does here too. Mm-hmm. It's saying, in effect, even a famous pagan prophet knows that our God has the good stuff.
Yeah.
And that it's what our God says that's really going to carry the day.
But it's clear that when he's hired to curse the Israelites.
Yeah.
Surely he wasn't hired to speak in the name of Israel's God.
Right, because the man who hired him had no idea what was going on. In fact, even at the beginning, I'm not sure how good an idea Balaam himself had. He gets his enlightenment from a donkey.
Yeah.
Anyway, that the donkey can see things that he can't.
What do you make of this? What do you make of this little episode in the middle?
This is the cutest donkey before the banshees of Inisharan.
But a magical talking donkey?
We've got magical talking animals from chapter 2 of Genesis.
Okay.
This is.
What's the right? It does. It feels almost like an Aesop's fable, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What's the message?
And it's also a caricature of the famous pagan prophet.
Sure.
Even though he's going to come out looking good for a while, and mind you, his reputation doesn't hold up in the later tradition.
I know, isn't that funny?
Because he gets blamed for something later on that he isn't blamed for at all here in Numbers. Mm-hmm. But we'll get to that. But still, the fact that it's his donkey who sees the angel of the Lord standing in the way takes Balaam down a few pegs.
Sure.
I think so. Even though, obviously, he must have been a quite famous prophet. Otherwise, they wouldn't have bothered using him.
Right.
But if they were going to use him, they were going to use him to glorify Israel and Israel's God.
Mm-hmm. Is Balaam the only non-Israelite prophet mentioned by name in the Bible? I asked it as if I knew the answer, but I don't.
But you don't. Well, I can't think of one.
I can't either. But here,
I can't think. That's why I had to go to the Sibyl.
But but again, it's it's a remarkable thing to have in our biblical text. I think is this really lengthy story with this wonderful poetry. I mean, it goes on. Yeah. He goes on and on. 4 major speeches, all delivered by somebody who is not, just happened by. So.
Yeah, I think it's maybe worthwhile going through the last one of his oracles.
Yeah.
The oracle of Balaam son of Beor, oracle of a man whose eye is clear, even if it wasn't quite clear enough to see the angel of the Lord standing in
it's
the
clear
way.
now.
Yeah. The oracle of one who hears the words of God, who knows the knowledge of the Most High. And whoever wrote this poem is assuming that he's getting his stuff from the God of Israel. Mm-hmm. But now, later on, at least, you will have cases where people would generously allow that the God who makes revelations to a pagan prophet is actually the same God. but I'm not sure how far that goes here. I think this is probably an exceptional intervention by the God of Israel to enlighten Balaam, who sees visions of the Almighty, who falls down but with his eyes uncovered. Now, that's interesting because it gives you a little glimpse of what prophetic inspiration must have been like. Yeah. And it seems like he had some kind of a seizure.
Which we see elsewhere. Famously, Saul, sort of, the tradition of what we would call ecstatic prophecy.
Yeah. Now, the actual prophecy here becomes famous. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. It shall crush the borderlands of Moab and the territory of the Shethites. And we don't know a whole lot about these, but they show up in some ancient texts as the Shutu. Edom will become a possession, Seir a possession of its enemies. One out of Jacob shall rule and destroy the survivors of it. So what he's doing here is predicting the conquest.
And what's more, at least it's worth pointing out that we're focusing here on the last of the poems. It's the only one that does this. Right? The first three are all nice praise of Israel.
Yeah.
And suddenly this has a historical dimension. He's predicting the conquest. Is he predicting beyond the conquest?
Well, later tradition certainly thought he was, because this becomes one of the standard messianic oracles, for example, already in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And sometimes actually in the Dead Sea Scrolls it's taken as predicting two figures, one of whom is the star, and that would be the priestly Messiah, and then the scepter. Right. But the scepter, I think, because the passage I translated here is, he shall crush the borderlands of Moab and the territory of the Shethites. I think both of these are probably debatable, and later on it's taken as that what he was to do was to crush heads and skulls.
Yeah. And
this becomes really the standard job description for a Messiah later on. Although this wasn't particularly predicting a king. As far as I can tell, this is entirely just on the rise of Israel. You wonder a little bit of the setting of this. The other inscription we have, I think, is about the 8th century, something like that. I doubt that this goes back to the time before the settlement of the Israelite tribes, but it's a hostile gesture towards Israel's neighbors.
Sure.
And affirming, our right to rule and to dominate.
Right. Which really has almost no clear historical setting, because when was Israel really in such a position?
No. It's wishful thinking.
Yeah. As we move past the Balaam cycle, we get into, again, as always with numbers, a little bit of, there's some law, there's some various kinds of bits, there's some stories, there's a battle against the Midianites, there's the allotting of the land.
The one that comes immediately after Balaam is, I think, one of the more colorful stories in the whole thing. And this is the episode at Baal Peor. And in later tradition, Balaam gets blamed for this.
In later tradition, within the Bible itself.
Yeah. He is the one who misleads the Israelites and takes them into to this. So what happens is, Israel was staying at Shittim. The people began to have sexual relations with the women of Moab. And these invited the people to their sacrifices. As you mentioned earlier, sacrifices could be parties. This was an occasion when there was meat to be eaten. And the people ate and bowed down to their gods. This is still an issue in the New Testament. It's a major reason why you weren't supposed to socialize, because the socializing with pagans usually happened in a cultic context.
Yeah, I mean, this is almost a case. This is like a case study in an idea that is omnipresent, certainly in the Pentateuch, which is,
and in the ancient world,
you have to stay away from the people who worship other gods, because if you start sleeping with them and marrying them and hanging out with them, you'll you'll forget which God you're supposed to be loyal to.
So hanging out takes a whole new meaning in this passage. Because then the Lord said to Moses, take the chiefs of the people and impale them in the sun.
Yeah.
There's hanging out for you before the Lord. Crucify them, in effect. Well,
let's not. That's
it
maybe
wasn't
going too far.
well, impaling,
the sentiment is the same.
I think this was more the way the Persians did it.
Yeah, it's the same. It's the same
Stick
sense
people
of
on a sharp pole.
The public death.
But
Sure.
public, shameful, and painful.
Yeah.
All at once. And that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away. And just then, one of the Israelites came and brought a Midianite woman into his family in the sight of Moses and the sight of the whole congregation of the Israelites. Now, why does he get, you wonder, first of all, where did he get a Midianite woman? They were in Moab up to now, but you need a Midianite woman to make a point here. And why a Midianite woman?
What would you like to connect that to?
Well,
had
somebody done that before?
to Moses' Midianite wife, perhaps?
Well, you would think so. But in this case, it isn't a criticism of Moses for marrying a Cushite woman,
right.
The way we had it in the other story. But he brought a Midianite woman into the camp in the sight of Moses. Now, should Moses have disapproved of somebody marrying a Midianite woman?
Is this marrying?
Well, that's right. It's not marrying, but having relations with a Midianite woman. Yeah.
And the question, so I'm not sure that there's a who and there's a where aspect here, right? Because I think that this story is supposed to be taking place in the sacred space, right? And I think that's a pretty significant part of what the affront is here. Is that
well, ultimately, though, what happens in the man's tent. So he isn't. He brought him into the congregation. It's into the camp. Now, of course, in the setting here in the wilderness, you don't have a temple yet,
right.
And so it's often hard to know, or something standing, symbolizing the temple.
Yeah.
So that its sacred space is the issue. But he takes her into, well, when the people were standing at the entrance of the tent of meeting. So, if he didn't take her into it, he at least brought her by it in their sight. And then when Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, saw it, he got up and left the congregation. Taking a spear in his hand, he went after the Israelite man into the tent and pierced the two of them, the Israelite and the woman, through the belly. And so the plague was ceased. Now, and then the Lord spoke to Moses, Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath. Therefore I grant him my covenant of peace. Now, Phinehas becomes the exemplar of zeal. Now, zeal is a zero tolerance attitude, and not unknown in the modern world, I would say. And it's one way of expressing religiosity.
I was going to say, it's certainly prized also in the ancient world. We have, the parallel story to this in my mind is from Exodus, where the Levites all go around, at Moses' command, go around slaughtering their neighbors and family members.
Yeah.
Yeah, here's another story about a priest who is doing something similar. I think there is a notion that those who are truly professionally devoted to the Lord need to have that kind of an attitude, right? They're protecting something.
Dare we say it was a form of jihad?
I wouldn't, but I would be careful there. But I do think that there is, as you put, a certain type of zeal associated with priesthood.
Yeah, but it is a form of. You get it in all religions, I think. You certainly get it in Christianity too, from time to time. People who are fanatically devoted to their religious ideals and prepared to kill for it.
And when the Bible promotes that and says God rewards Phinehas, So now you can imagine, I mean, I'm thinking about communities then that say, well, like we could all be a kingdom of priests, or we could all be a community of zealots. I'm thinking about Dead Sea communities, right? People who say, we're going to take this to the extreme because the Bible gives us an exemplar of someone who is rewarded for doing so.
And is rewarded then, ironically, with a covenant of peace and an eternal priesthood. That's what the reward is. Actually, the people later on who take this as their exemplar aren't the people of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're first of all the Maccabees, and Mattathias explicitly invokes Eleazar as the model for how to act. When you're faced with flagrant evil, what do? You get your spear.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is then what the Zealots, how they saw themselves. Now, the Zealots sometimes get a bad rap, but I think that's largely because they lost
in the
way? End, whereas the Maccabees come off much better because they had at least for a time a success. But the attitude, I think, is much the same. And this, I think, has to be part of the religious legacy, shall we say, of the Book of Numbers.